Welcome to the new seminar of the New Center by Daniel Sacilotto. It is titled Abstraction, Paranoia, and Transcendental Philosophy and the Limits of Thought. Sacilotto's seminar traces key moments in the history of transcendental philosophy, departing from its overt elaboration in Kant's critical methods. At the most general level, transcendental explanations or argumentation can be understood in terms of two central postulates. One, that it is the job of philosophy to analyze the conditions of access to the world, and correspondingly of empirical cognition. However, these conditions, the world or cognition themselves, are ultimately to be conceived. Two, that there is a deductive schema that can show how these conditions are invariant constraints or structures of all possible experience, however experience is ultimately conceived. Departing from this minimal methodological core, the history of transcendental philosophy has unfolded as a progressive radicalization of its incipient Kantian formulation in terms of the investigation into the possibility of synthetic a priori judgments within a representational account of experience. Thinkers after Kant have accordingly sought to interrogate both the forms of mediation that condition our experience of the world beyond those explored under Kant's account of apperceptive consciousness, as well as the cogency of the deductive procedure proposed therein in the form of a transcendental logic. Such attempts have thus expanded our understanding of experience beyond the sensory and conceptual forms examined by Kant, exploring practical, linguistic, historical, and cultural forms of mediation. From neo-Kantian attempts to naturalize Kant's insights in the wake of developments in the natural and social sciences, to Husserl's formal ontology and phenomenological account of intentionality, to Heidegger's existential analytic of Dasein's being in the world, to Deleuze's transcendental empiricist's account of larval subjectivation, to Laruelle's non-philosophical project for a first science for both philosophy and science. In this trajectory, we shall see transcendental discourse follows a vector of increasing abstraction, at every turn revealing uninterrogated assumptions in previously identified forms of intentionality and experience. In the name of science, philosophy, or post-philosophical thinking, the prospects of laying the ground for metaphysics turns out to harbor latent metaphysical prejudices that transcendental inquiry seeks to exorcise and conceptualize. As the conditions of all possible experience turn out to be in themselves conditions laden with dogmatic assumptions, the very sources of a transcendental logic or theory become increasingly precarious. Accordingly, as this vector of radicalization proceeds, transcendental inquiry progressively leads philosophy into a general crisis. For as the investigation into the conditions of all possible experience can never secure a stable foundation, the very possibility of freeing philosophy from dogmatic metaphysics becomes ever more elusive. As critical epistemological, fundamental ontological, and ethical vocabularies become themselves interrogated, the critical impetus to examine the conditions of all possible experience or access to the world devolves into a generic methodological paranoia, eroding the constructive and positive pretensions of philosophical discourse as a whole. In the first week, we examined the initial configuration of the transcendental method in Kant's first critique and its subsequent problematization in Fichte's attempt to ground the positional reflexibility of the subject of apperception. In the second week, we examined the elaboration of the transcendental subjects into a formal ontology in two successive arcs. The formal ontological investigation of intentionality proposed by the transcendental phenomenology of Edmund Husserl and its proposed mathematical formalization into an eidetic geometry by Jean Petitot and Martin Heidegger's displacement of objective intentionality within an existential analytic of Dasein's being in the world, reaching its terminal crisis as he attempts to drive human temporality from time as such. In the third week, we examined the attempts to pursue a materialist transvaluation of transcendental idealism in Gilles Deleuze's Transcendental Empiricists program, and Gabriel Catrin's recently elaborated phenomenological projects. In the fourth and final session, we examine the attempts to draw out the transcendental conditions for immanence, looking at Michel Henry's account of radical immanence and François Laurel's attempt to leverage a non-philosophical axiomatic first science that subtracts transcendental inquiry from philosophy and functions as a mode of discourse according to the conditions of real immanence or the vision in one. Daniel Sacilotto is a PhD in comparative literature from University of California, Los Angeles. His research focuses on the fields of contemporary philosophy and Latin American literature. In particular, his research focuses on the reconciliation of rationalism and materialism and the methodological relationship between epistemology and ontology in contemporary philosophy. He's currently finishing a full-length monograph tentatively titled Saving the Noumenon, an essay on the foundations of ontology, in which he proposes a critical reading of the ontological turn in contemporary philosophy and lays the foundations for a new transcendental epistemology, chiefly inspired in the works of Wilfrid Sellars, Robert Brandom, Alain Badiou, Laurence Puntel, Ray Bressier, Reza Negarestani, and Jay Rosenberg. And so, Daniel, you can now begin the seminar.
Thank you, Evrim. Welcome, everybody. I apologize very much for having had to postpone the seminar for a week. I had a family emergency I had to attend to. I just literally 2 days ago got back from Peru, where I'm from. So apologies for that. That's the first thing. The second thing is there has been some restructuration of the syllabus, which will be uploaded at the end of today in its latest form. Just cleaning up some things and taking some readings away, considering that it is a rather short seminar. And so we won't get to cover as much material as I would have liked to, and trying to, obviously make time for everybody and for conversation to ensue. I have stripped away a few materials that I believed were just simply not going to be possible to be covered responsibly within the time that we have. Hopefully everybody got to take a look at the Kant text for today, which was what we will be talking to as we proceed. But the structure for today will be, as most introductory sessions go, first asking everybody to introduce themselves very quickly, though, so that we can get to business. Just say who you are, what your sort of interest in the course might be, and finally, what is your background training in philosophy, which is always important for me to know, so as to know what I need to explain as far as background goes. So can we very quickly, before we get anything started, just start introducing ourselves, everyone who's in the seminar, going from the top. I'm going to go from what I see, so in order. Andrew McCarroll, and please correct me if I mispronounce your name.
It's all good. You got it right. Basically, what I'm here for, what I'm interested in. To be honest, I have very little philosophical background, actually. I've taken like a course in like Islamic philosophy and got like a passing grade in logic, so I'm a little bit of an amateur on this. Part of my interest in this is because I figure at some point I got to face up to Kant, because I must at some point, basically doing the equivalent of like a mental deadlift. But also getting a little bit of a grasp on this. A lot of my sort of interests are lately having to deal with the concept of like dreams as objects, video games, or AI as like half rendered consciousnesses, that sort of thing. And so taking a look at Kant and what seems to be to me a project of trying to apprehend a framework for how to interpret and make meaning from the world, feels like it's important not only just on an aesthetic level, which I'm very interested in aesthetics, partially out of my like English major background, but also just projects on how consciousness works. So that is a very quick and dirty explanation, and we'll see how the rest of this goes.
Thank you. Next we have Armin Salavarsi.
Man, you did a good job there. No Iranian actually can pronounce my name. Thank you. That was quite right. I'm Arman Salavarsi. I'm from Iran. Background philosophy, not much really. year and a half, quote unquote, autodidacting. I'm here because of some itch that I cannot attend to myself, and that itch is transcendental unity of apperception. I think something that I read that I cannot deal with is that, and I'm mainly here for that. And what else? Is that okay? Is that enough?
Fine. That works. Cool, thank you. Then we have Catherine Adams.
Hi. Yeah, so I have a bit of a background in philosophy. I did my bachelor's in philosophy, and I was mostly focused on German philosophy, and then later critical theory. Now I work in the arts, so it's been a while that I was kind of deep in these problems, and I'm sort of just here to renew my work in this field, and maybe to draw some connections between my current interests in like aesthetics and philosophy of art, but mostly just to kind of return to these problems and keep trying to, be able to think of them in a relatively rigorous way. So, yeah.
Thank you. Then we have Keith Ignat.
Hi. Yeah. So also not much of a background in philosophy. My education was in economics. I'm preparing for graduate study in philosophy. Hopefully this is my first seminar here at the new center. So obviously anticipating a little bit of a challenge here, but excited for the prospects of the course.
Cool, thank you. Then we have Marcantonio Bracale. We can't hear you, unfortunately. The mic, I think, might be, or the volume. Okay, so I'll go to the next person, and then you can. Okay, so then we have Vincent Ardinone.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yep.
My name is Vincent. I'm a writer and researcher based in Manila, and it's currently 2 o'clock in the morning here. My undergraduate degree is in language and literature, so I have a basic grasp of some post-structuralism and continental philosophy, but I consider myself a dilettante, really. I'm really excited to learn more about Kant, his method, and the historical trajectory of his thought, because I just feel myself going back again and again with the first critique. And I'm excited to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. Then we have Philippe Felizardo.
Hi, I'm in Porto, Portugal. No academic background, but currently trying to start studying philosophy. And I'm here because I said this yesterday. Sorry, I'm not very fresh today. Basically, I decided to divide my brain into multiple small parts and study different sections of the history of philosophy. And I'm here because I'm quite amazed by our capacity to abstract, and I want to learn more from it. I've read stuff of yours, and it's quite enriching. So, hope to learn about it. Thanks.
Thank you. Then we have George Macbeth.
Hello, can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I'm currently studying a magister, which is like the German version of an MA in some universities, in art research and media philosophy in the University of the Arts at Karlsruhe, which is in southern Germany near Stuttgart. And I had a BA in philosophy, but that was quite a long time ago. But then back then we did study the first critique, and I'm as puzzled as I remember being as puzzled as Armin says by the transcendental unity of apperception. And my attraction to the course is yeah, I suppose kind of threefold. I'm interested in first of all, like what the current status of critique is, like whether and how this relates to kind of various aporias around post-Kantian critique, and yeah, and I suppose the status of Kant's critique, and secondly, relatedly, the relationship between kind of paranoia and certain forms of critique, and I think the suggestion of that in the title was enough to entice me. And then thirdly, Daniel, a few years ago, you gave a presentation at a conference that some friends of mine organized in Milan, and I remember being very kind of impressed, but also slightly bamboozled, and thinking I need to, get up to speed on. And so, yeah.
Thank you. Everyone, by the way, I believe Saida is asking to be promoted to panelist in the chat room. I don't know if she has, but I cannot see her within the windows of attendees. So
Okay, I will do it.
Please keep track of that just in case other people show up that need that, just in case. Maria is next. Maria Koroleva, sorry. Maria Koroleva.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. I'm an art critic. I'm in Moscow. And how to explain the background? The art criticism courses are quite comprehensive. So we have had Kant, Hegel, Marxism, quite lame psychoanalysis. This seems not at first, but not when you dive in. So I'm trying to, now I'm studying image and symbol in art and Warburg against Kasirer. And Warburg was an anti-Kantian. And so in order to understand anti-Kantians, I need to understand the Kantians. So this is why I'm here.
Cool. Thank you. Next we have Edna Amador.
Hi everyone, I'm Edna Amador. I'm from Mexico City. I am an undergraduate student in philosophy and a certificate student here in the new center. And my main interest in this course is, of course, Kant, because in college he was one of my favorite authors. So I want to go beyond my current studies. So that's it.
Cool. Thank you. Next, we have Alejandra Rodriguez Bolaños.
Hi, I'm from Mexico also, but from the south of Mexico, in a state that names Veracruz. I'm living here now. I'm studying here situated knowledge through the arts, visual arts and archives. I don't have a philosophical background, but I'm trying to, now I'm in a process of reading theories about art here. So I thought that I can find some, I don't know, like references here. Yeah.
Thank you. Then we have Matthews Ferreira.
Hi, my background, so I am in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. My original background is in biology and neuroscience and then cognitive science, but then I changed I did my master's degree in studying cybernetics and the history of cybernetics, and that got me a lot into philosophy of mind. And now I'm actually doing my PhD research on materialism and all the history of materialism. So I think there is a lot to be learned in this seminar, because my research interests are pretty much let's say juxtaposed with the entire bibliography. So that would be very nice. Thank you.
Thank you. Then we have George Rowley.
Yeah, hi, I'm in great state of Maine right now. I just finished up my first year of my master's degree in philosophy at the University of Houston. And the reason I'm here is because the stuff that we study I find to be a little bit depressingly analytic. And everything that I want to be reading is pretty much the stuff that this class is going to be walking through, and I just don't have the opportunity to do it in my program. And so I found this class and just got super excited. And yeah, I'm really looking forward to finally having someone teach me about this stuff instead of having to try to teach myself about all of it. So yeah.
Cool. And we have Federico Nieto.
Hey Daniel, hey everybody. I'm a researcher and certificate student in the program of critical philosophy at the New Center. I'm based in Bogota, Colombia. I'm also about to defend my MA dissertation in philosophy at the National University of Colombia. I absolutely hated it. And I've also had lockdown burnout, but basically my interest is in like responding the question, like researching about the question of structure in contemporary political organization against a buzzword that has become very popular of what's going on in my country, against molecular revolution, affect theory, everything that has to do with Deleuze and Guattari in political organization. I want to make a critique. So I think structuralism in Marxism and analytical philosophy can help me achieve that. So thank you.
Thank you. Then we have Saide Asadipur. You're muted.
Yes.
Sorry. Yes.
So hi, I'm Saide, and I'm art history PhD candidate in University of Wisconsin-Madison, and my PhD dissertation is on new media arts from the Arab world. But currently, for a shared project, I'm working on the aesthetic tradition in the late modern arts, focusing on some minimalist sculptures. I mean, those big size, site-specific sculptures. And so the standard interpretation of those works is mostly about like eliminating or dismantling the transcendental investment that actually takes place in the viewer's perception. But it seemed to me that they just simply displaced the transcendental subject with like a phenomenological one. So for my work, I still want to take the transcendental aesthetic as my point of departure, but I like to to rethink the way that this sort of, what is that, anti-transcendental quality works by finding some ways to open out the current argument to include like more creative and more contingent features of the site. So yes, that's it.
Then we have Marcantonio Bercale. Hopefully this time again, one more time. Yeah, there we go. Now we can hear you.
Yes. Okay. So I'm Marcantonio. I live in Amsterdam in the Netherlands. I have a background in philosophy. I have an MA in phenomenology. My degree is on the project to naturalize phenomenology, but that was 2 years ago. Now I study memetics and internet research, but I'm interested in the Transcendental project in general, how to transcend the unity of the perception, all the unities in general. And so I can talk about topics about like virtual reality, psychedelic research, consciousness research, neurofeedback. So I want to be more updated about the Transcendental project because when I studied it, I was more closer to Husserl, but that was 100 years ago. So yeah.
Cool. Then we have Alan Diaz.
Hi everyone, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Oh, my name is Alan, I'm from Mexico City. I have a background in architecture and also some philosophy, critical theory. And well, I'm here because I'm an avid follower of Daniel's courses, which are always really good. And yeah, in the topics that we're going to study, I've recently been interested in the question, the critique of real abstraction from Marxism. So I know this is like a completely different and even opposed understanding of abstraction that probably we're going to see in this course, but it's like a nice complement. So yeah.
Then we have Nadia.
Hey, yes. Oh, I'm in the Midwest, in the United States, and my background is in the arts, and arts illustration and like experimental writing. And my interest in this course is like one of my main focuses for research is like psycholinguistics, cognitive metaphor theory, narratology, and just like I also just used to be into like researching like the way that schizophrenics speak and like how that has to do with like how they experience the world. So just like in general, in terms of writing and stuff, I'm interested in like what the limits of thought are, experience, and like how that relates to language. So yeah.
Cool. Then we have Andrew Macaro.
I believe I went the first time around.
Oh, crap. Sorry, I apologize. Then we have Atefe.
Hello, I'm here by mistake. I was on audit and I was promoted. Like I don't know why.
Oh, okay. Then we have
that's my mistake. Sorry.
No worries. Dilshad, I also see two windows of you. I don't know why.
Yeah. Sorry. In case my internet gets cut off, so just
Okay.
a content discipline. Hi, my name is Dilshad. I'm a medical doctor. I have no background in philosophy, but I have taken other courses with Daniel and Reza and other instructors at the new center. The reason why I'm interested in this course is mainly because I think I have a superficial understanding of the whole continental tradition. You know, for example, Deleuze, Laurel, which I hope Daniel will cover. I'm more analytically oriented, so.
Cool. Then we have Dana Burns.
Hi, I'm in New York. My background is in art history, and I'm a writer. I'm here out of mostly curiosity and just trying to face Kant head on rather than obliquely.
Cool. Then we have, let's see, there's a second page here. Kirill Potapov.
Thanks. Hi. So I'm a PhD student in human-computer interaction. I'm looking at identity formation, mainly through Sellers on the one side and Marxist Soviet thinkers on the other. But yeah, I'm interested in this intersection of thinkers in this course as well. Thank you.
Cool. And I believe finally we have JD. JD, Romina, can hear you? Can we hear you? Can you speak? No. Okay. Romina does not want to speak. All right, great. Welcome everybody. It's nice. It's a very large group. I'm merrily surprised. Welcome to the seminar. Obviously, since it's a much larger group than I expected, I'm going to have to talk to the organizers about the work structure. There's going to be a paper involved at the end, and there's going to be some sort of interactive, but I'm not sure we're going to be able to fit in, presentations for everybody, considering we only have 4 weeks. For the workload and that part of the thing, we'll get things sorted out after this week, because I really have to speak with the organizers considering the size of the group at present. Okay. But with that said, let me just start introducing the course. It's a diverse group. Many of you do not have substantive background in philosophy, so much of what I will say will also be in a manner of introduction for those who do not have precisely a philosophical background. Of course, today what I want to do, as the title suggests, and as the reading was meant to, sort of dive us right into the question, is focus on Kant's inception of the transcendental method. But before we get into Kant proper, I want to begin by explaining what's the motivation behind the course, the seminar, the idea that sort of gives birth to it, and then progressively descend to the Kant text itself. We won't be speaking about Fichte. Unfortunately, I will be mentioning how it is roughly that German idealism after Kant takes on the question, or the problematic of the transcendental further. But I think that's one of the things that I think we have to abbreviate, unfortunately, for reasons of time and length. Okay, so those of you who have attended previous seminars with me know that I am a master of the PowerPoint. I happen to fit about 6,000 words per slide, and this is no different. In fact, I have a wonderful PowerPoint prepared for everybody, good old style. So if you don't mind, I will go right ahead and start sharing my screen with a lot of you. Can we all see the slideshow? Yes, cool, great. So today, the birth of the transcendental. So let's get right started with stuff. And it's gonna get thick, by the way. This is not gonna be an easy class. It's gonna be extremely, extremely dense. And as you've noticed, the readings, of course, are mostly, in this occasion, continental based, even though my training covers both analytic and continental philosophy. However, they are some of the most obtuse, abstract, of course, texts in the most vernacular possible sense of the word. So be prepared. And one of the reasons why I've decided to abbreviate the syllabus is because of this degree of difficulty that's involved. Every seminar that I teach tries to revolve around a central question, which I lay out at the outset. And the central question that animates this seminar in particular is, to what extent is the transcendental method of philosophy possible? Okay, that's the question that in its first formulation is going to guide us. So that already tells us something interesting and something important to underline about the nature of the question that we are to undertake in these weeks, which is transcendental philosophy pertains to a method, a particular method or way of doing philosophy. And the first question, of course, that we have to ask ourselves is, well, what method is this? What does this method involve? So the next thing that would jump out to anybody who has a morsel of comprehension of Kant, for example, is that the question as it is formulated at the top here is already meta-theoretic. Because Kant's project is often stated and rehearsed by commentators and by Kant himself as a project of laying out the conditions of possibility of experience. Transcendental philosophy and the critical project that Kant begins in the first critique is a project of laying out the conditions of possibility of experience. But if this is the case, then the question that we are asking concerning the range and scope of the transcendental method can be then therefore reformulated or paraphrased as the following question. To what extent is an investigation into the conditions of possibility of experience itself possible? Right? So if transcendental philosophy asks about the invariant conditions of possibility of experience, then our question is, to what extent is the investigation into the conditions of possibility itself possible? To what extent is transcendental philosophy itself possible? But of course, this is not precise enough either, because one of the things that we will see is that, in fact, transcendental philosophy does not delimit itself in its history to an interrogation into the conditions of possibility of experience. Actually, many philosophers after Kant will dislodge or displace transcendental investigation from an examination into experience or subjective conditions. Some thinkers, for example, will transpose the transcendental into the world and will speak about how it is that the very structure of nature or space and time or the world itself obeys something that can be called a transcendental structure or a transcendental organization. Well, in this case, obviously, we're no longer in Kantian territory. We're no longer asking about the conditions of representation of the world, as Kant asks in the first critique, right? We're asking about something quite different. So to what extent can the transcendental as a method, right, be transposed from its incipient formulation and elaboration within Kant's theory of experience into something quite different? Traditionally, we think that transcendental philosophy is born out of an attempt to lay out a propedeutic investigation to metaphysics, right? So the story goes, philosophers before Kant, pre-critical thinkers, were indulging in metaphysics in a quote unquote dogmatic and arbitrary manner. People just did metaphysics in an attempt to describe the most general structures of being or the world. but they had not yet arrived, so the story goes, at a proper methodological footing. And what Kant does is precisely to ask the question before metaphysics, what are the conditions of possibility of not only experience, but therefore of all empirical cognition, and therefore of metaphysical cognition itself? How is metaphysics itself possible? But as I have already sort of suggested, as transcendental method becomes dislodged from this representational account of experience, which is born in Kant, we see that the separation or the methodological propedeutic nature of transcendental philosophy becomes itself problematized. For example, the work of Gilles Deleuze, for those of you who are familiar with him, proposes something like a transcendental metaphysics, a transcendental empiricist metaphysics. And in fact, this is already perceptible in the immediate aftermath of the German idealist sequence after Kant. Schelling, for example, proposes a kind of transcendental physics, which again no longer examines the conditions of representation of the world in the sense of the invariant structures that organize our experience of space and time and our understanding, but rather how it is that the forms of nature or nature itself becomes individuated in a way that is, in a way, not bound simply to conditions of experiential mediation, but they are strongly objective or real in a way that is not within the scope of Kant's representation. I think I heard of a
So with the
Kirill, I think you you need to mute your well, okay, I will just keep going. So in any case, the question of transcendental investigation, the transcendental method, becomes, after Kant, we will see, exploded and reconceived, either by reconceiving the very concept of experience and expanding our concept of experience beyond those forms of representational mediation that Kant identifies as structuring experience, or as dislodging the transcendental from experience altogether. So, long story short, our course is basically a very protracted and unfortunately protracted examination of this history of the transcendental method and transcendental philosophy. And of course, the other sort of vector that animates this course, the other part of it, is how it is that the transcendental method is bound to an interrogation concerning the limits of philosophy itself. Because, as many of you will know probably, one of the things that animates the critical project born in Kant's first critique is already to delimit the scope of what philosophy is good for, what philosophy can do. And indeed, already the first locution that identifies the transcendental method as an investigation into the quote unquote conditions of possibility of experience, or the conditions of all possible experience, is a question of delimitation, right? So we have a demarcation question. The question of demarcation of philosophy. What exactly is philosophy? Where does it end? And this is an interesting question because, as we will see, this apparently methodological rigorous, this question of methodological rigor, how do we delimit the possibility of experience, the conditions of possible experience, as the transcendental method becomes exploded and dislodged and radicalized and expanded, leads very soon into a question, into a crisis of and for philosophy itself. As transcendental philosophy expands its horizons and sort of radicalizes its methodological demands, also progressively, philosophy comes under stress to define what it can do and what it cannot do, and eventually finds itself sort of corralled into a deadlock where it becomes progressively emptied of license or authority to speak. And that's why there is this other concept, of course, in the title, abstraction. Abstraction understood not simply in the sense of us speaking in an impractical manner, in a way dislodged from the clouds or whatever, but the way in which transcendental philosophy, precisely in attempting to lay out the conditions of possibility of experience and later the conditions of individuation of reality itself and so on, progressively has to pull itself further and further back into examining the conditions of the conditions of the conditions of the conditions and so on and so forth, until it progressively voids itself of content. And there is a moment, a very beautiful moment, we will see at the height of our course, at the end of the journey, where we reach something like the most purified form of transcendental philosophy known to man to this day, which is Francois Laurel's non-philosophy, I think, where this movement of progressive abstraction and this methodological cleansing of philosophy, of its attempt to free itself from any sort of quote unquote empirical residues and reach the height of examining the pure conditions of thinking, reaches something like an almost celestial quality. Non-philosophy has an extraordinary degree of sort of non-empirical groundedness that I think makes it remarkable. One thing that I posted in Facebook, of all places, of course, was that if today philosophy and everybody that goes into philosophy seems so obsessed with the question of how does philosophy inform us practically about the world today? How do we make philosophy applicable to either politics or the arts? Everything is so importantly, is bound to the idea of how we make philosophy relevant to our lives. This course, in a way, is a recipe or a sort of a relaxation against this tendency, and goes in the completely opposite direction. It goes to how it is that philosophy can become itself as removed as possible from the ground of life and practical immediacy, and reach this quote unquote heavens of abstraction. So it's in a way the opposite sort of disposition that philosophy, in relation to what philosophy takes in our day and time mostly. Also notice another thing, another propedeutic observation to make is that the question about the limits of philosophy is peculiar insofar as it's not like the question that it's not like asking about the limits of anything else or any other regional discipline. Because if we ask, for example, about, the example I give in the slide is telling the limits of biology, right? Okay, so what do we do there? We think about what are the native concepts of biology, life, and so on and so forth, and we separate its domain of investigation from whatever else we want to say belongs to the sciences, right? So from physics, from chemistry, and so on. To what extent these overlap or do not, that's the question of demarcation. But the question of the limits of philosophy becomes so extremely radically difficult to adjudicate that, as we all know, it's not only that we have different traditions within philosophy, analytic and continental, but philosophy itself conceives itself in radically opposed ways. And it's not even clear that philosophy has a quote unquote regional domain of beings or entities to which it devotes itself, right? There is something extreme about philosophy in its attempt to think about quote unquote the conditions of possibility of experience, or its attempt to think beings as a whole or being as a whole. If, therefore, the question is not about delimiting a domain of entities or beings that define the scope or domain of investigation of philosophy, then asking about the limits of philosophy is, quite a different matter, right? It's not simply about giving a stable catalog of entities. And part of what we're going to be examining is precisely how it is that in asking about the question of limits, we have this spiraling out of control of philosophy into a vector of abstraction, which empties itself of content as well. So what does philosophy investigate, right? If we just wanted to ask that, if it's not a regional domain, is it the world as a whole, which is, the metaphysical question, beings as a whole, right? The conditions of knowledge, is Kant things, are being in the world, which is the Heideggerian sort of conception, or at least the propedeutic one in the Analytic of Dasein, right? The historical disclosure of being in the second Heidegger, truth, right? All of the above. There's no stable answer here. So obviously, one of the things we're going to see is how transcendental method pushes philosophy to reconceive of its task progressively as well. So here's another point, this time concerning the concept of abstraction. And generally, and this is actually a Hegelian point, if we want to make it, is that in the vernacular, we generally contrast the abstract in the sense of something, that is obtuse or impractical or something of the sort to the concrete. And the concrete is understood as life, material being, bodies and languages, real problems, et cetera, et cetera. But since the modern period, and particularly Hegel is one to emphasize this point, Zizek likes to make this point time and time again, there's a kind of curious inversion of the relationship between the abstract and the concrete. He gives the example, Zizek does, of a cigarette, right? Normally, I'm smoking a cigarette, let's say. I'm not, but like, okay, whatever. Or let's say I'm holding my phone, right? This is concrete, the phone itself, right? Me showing you the phone, everybody. What is abstract is theory, you know, me thinking about the perils of late capitalist culture or the techno-capitalist singularity that Nick Land, you know, advocates for or whatever. But with Hegel, we get the opposite sort of insight. There's nothing more abstract, in fact, than me showing you the stupid phone just like this. Immediate sensory presentation is itself, without conceptual mediation, empty of content. It is nothing but empty abstraction. What renders sensory presentation concrete and contentful is conceptual specification. The fact that I can say about the phone precisely that it is a product of late capitalist culture, that is a techno-capitalist singularity waiting to take over the world or whatever, right? That is to say, abstraction is actually real experience when it becomes void of conceptual content. So this is the other interesting thing, right? Abstraction in the philosophical sense in which it has to do with conceptualization or conceptual content, as we will see, begins with the idea of trying to precisely delimit the conditions of possible experience, which in Kant's case is an account of what he names the pure concepts of the understanding, finally, the pure conditions of thinking. But to specify these pure conditions of thinking, the most general concepts that structure all possible experience, soon takes us to waters that go far beyond what representation allows, at least as Kant conceives it. One of the questions that I am most obsessed with in my own research is the question of representation in philosophy. How is the concept of representation, which is elaborated in the modern period, really in a rigorous manner, itself re-elaborated, critiqued, dislodged, and so on and so forth. And one of the things we're going to see is precisely how it is that even though transcendental philosophy is born as wed to a representational account of experience precisely, it then becomes displaced in this manner as part of a critique of representation, and not only displaced away from experience. Another way to make this point, I just note this at the bottom of the slide, is that one thing in 20th century analytic philosophy that analytic philosophers drew attention to was how it is that observation was theory laden, right? This is something that I always tell my students. We intuitively think that observation or sensory experience grants us somehow access to the world in a kind of immediate fashion, right? But of course, it doesn't take us very long to realize that there's a great deal of interpretation in how we perceive the world, and that our discursive and cognitive capacities lay to bear. In other words, that observation is already laden with a series of structures or contributions, both linguistic, perceptual, et cetera, et cetera. So there's no transparent window or access into the world, at least, right? So even observation is theory laden. That's another way of saying that even when we make an empirical report, like there is a phone, there's a cat on the mat, that the grass is green or whatever, we already use a battery of concepts that are bound to a specific either theory in the strict sense of a scientific theory, or just a natural language, English, Spanish, whatever you want, right? The second sense of abstraction that we understand intuitively is that abstraction involves something like pulling oneself apart or removing oneself from, attaining a kind of proper distance, right? And abstraction in this regard, insofar as it's wed to the transcendental method, is once again bound to the question of limits, how it is that we delimit the scope of philosophy. And in order to gain and delimit the scope of philosophy, one needs precisely to do this strange operation, which is removing oneself from empirical, cleansing our concepts from their empirical substratum, right? So how do we actually attain the proper distance to be able to see what philosophy can and cannot do? Requires from us a curious operation of removal, of precisely abstraction, in the sense of distancing oneself from the empirical. And this is really the bottom of what I am most sort of drawn to in this tradition of philosophy, which is this process, this almost quote unquote, almost theological undercurrent that goes within the transcendental tradition of an attempt to pursue purity and an attempt to free the concept or purify, distill the concept from any sort of vestige pertaining or contaminated by the old metaphysics, by experience, by the empirical, and so on. So pure concepts. The concept of purity here is another one that's going to come back to us. And well, the thing that is continues with the rest of my research also is one of the things that I have been exploring for years now is how it is that this sort of interrogation into the conditions of possibility of experience, once it becomes radicalized and sort of pushed to the extreme, really leads us to two possibilities, right? One is a kind of deadlock, a kind of point where philosophy no longer has anything to say, kind of empty, becomes itself void of content, or a point of extreme formalization. Extreme formalization in the sense of a constructive possibility, but a kind of attempt to reconstruct the foundations of philosophy, the methodological foundations of philosophy, in a way that, as we will see, attains either extreme mathematical rigor or else extreme conceptual vacuity in a way, or purity. And the examples I have in mind here are Francois Laruelle in the case of the conceptual sort of attempt to distill the concepts of what he names non-philosophy. And then in the other end, Petitot's attempt to formalize Husserl's phenomenology of perception, or phenomenological eidetics, which I incidentally need to say, we will be, quote unquote, reading a text by Petitot, but there is no way in living hell that we can cover that at the level of technical demand. It is extremely difficult. So one of the things that I will say, and we'll cross that bridge when we get to that, but that text will require for us to just look at what's going on, but we cannot get into the maths very deeply because it will kill us, right? We're talking serious leather there. With Laruelle, you'll see for yourselves when we get there. Also, the other concept, of course, is paranoia. And I'll stop after this just for decanting a little bit and just briefing up. Because, of course, one of the things that the description of the course already tells us is that this history of radicalization of the transcendental method and its dislodging from the representational account of experience is also bound to this idea of cleansing philosophy, cleansing itself from what it still harbored unknowingly or unwittingly within itself as a latent, undetected prejudice or dogmatic residue. So Kant wants to lay out the foundations of metaphysics, wants to do this propedeutic investigation into the conditions of all possible experience. But as many of you probably know, thinkers after Kant will detect that Kant had, despite his precautions and critical scrutiny, nevertheless harbored all of these undetected metaphysical assumptions. And we're going to talk about that in a little bit, how it is that in laying out precisely the foundations of the transcendental, already there is a kind of infiltration of metaphysics that comes from the back door, and one can already see that the project of laying out the conditions of all possible experience turns out to be contaminated. It's not what Kant thought it was. There was too much metaphysics in it. It was metaphysically laden. So thinkers after Kant will try to precisely depurate or cleanse this residual metaphysical baggage that contaminated and polluted and ultimately frustrated Kant's ambition. Now, to what extent are these criticisms waged against Kant fair or not is also a question that we will, of course, have to address. But we will see this actually much more subtle than history will lead us to believe. Normally, it is said something like, the traditional narrative goes something like, well, yes, Kant still presupposed something like the categories of the understanding as these metaphysical invariants that he just basically inflects into the mind of the subject, whereas before they were objectively localized as structures in the world. So that's no good. Then you get something like, Heidegger and Husserl, who precisely try to go beyond this essentialist categorical framework or understanding of being and of the subject in an investigation of Dasein and historical conditions. That's not wrong. It's just it's actually much more interesting than that. There's much more. It's much more tricky, and Kant himself is much trickier to detect. And of course, the same goes, Heidegger's diagnosis and Husserl's sort of re-elaboration are much more interesting than that kind of narrative will lead us to believe. And we'll already see that today in a little bit. And, you know, paranoia, the reason why I use this term is because this becomes particularly acute in its sort of transcendental, in the aftermath of the transcendental phenomenological tradition, paradigmatically emblemized by Heidegger. But the idea is that this attempt to cleanse and to correct the residual metaphysical baggage that was carried in the representational account of experience leads philosophy progressively precisely to a kind of voiding of itself. You can never be freed sufficiently from your metaphysical baggage, and this means that you progressively void your what you are allowed authoritatively to say in order to be able to ground or to arrive at a secure foundation, to the point where precisely you lead philosophy into a kind of methodological crisis. If representation does not form or give us a foundation, if the categories of the understanding do not give us a foundation, then what does? What gives the transcendental method, insofar as it is possible, if it is possible, a beginning? Where does it begin, right? And this becomes tortuous. It becomes tortuous for philosophers themselves. And you'll see this specifically in the case of Heidegger, when specifically in the height, at the moment of crisis of the project in Being and Time in the late 20s, he finds himself cornered into the same problem that Kant faced, which is the problem of the transcendental deduction. He needs something like a transcendental deduction, but he cannot secure it. He cannot find the resources to do it. And so he ends up sort of deferring the question and then returns to Kant. And one of the most beautiful moments in the history of philosophy occurs here, where you see Heidegger almost like digging into a cave, going back to the origin of the transcendental method and going back to Kant. And he finds in Kant that already this problem that he was facing at the height of the transcendental phenomenological project was already there in Kant's account of the faculties. That Kant already faced this abyss that transcendental philosophy faces, that looking at the abyss, the resources of a transcendental logic, and therefore the resources made available for a transcendental deduction, became completely voided. Kant could not, in fact, secure the ground for a transcendental deduction. He has to cheat. And we'll see exactly what this means in Kant's account in brief. But Heidegger, finds this, this is what I've called elsewhere the return to the abyss, and when Heidegger sort of goes back into the cave of the Kantian, to the first critique, and finds in the theory of the faculties this deadlock. And then this is the moment in which the phenomenological transcendental project that he was carrying out collapses. And the kere, the turn, that we as often described as moving away from transcendental phenomenology to the history of being, begins there, actually, in this moment. And we'll see that moment because it's a beautiful moment. There's something in the chat. Let me just make sure that, and I'll stop sharing for a brief second here. Transcendental philosophy is the extremist scholasticism of reconciled theology and reason. That's actually a really good locution. And I do think that there is much of that as well, right? If we understand that if the central philosophical obsession of the medieval period and scholastic period was to reconcile the sort of inheritance of Greek philosophy, both in its Platonist and Aristotelian forms, with theological insight, then modern philosophy sort of carries this or radicalizes this in the attempt to sort of purify the concept and arrive at sort of a secure foundation of knowledge, right? Which leads to these crazy variations in systematic philosophy and in German idealism in particular. So yeah, let me stop there for any questions or comments or thoughts. Anything wants to jump in here? This is just all very, of course, introductory before we get into anything very concrete.
I have a short question, Daniel.
Sure.
I just want to make one thing sure. By the word abyss, did you mean you talked about the abyss that Kant encounters, and he realized the impossibility of transcendental deduction, right?
Yes.
That's what you are trying to say. And the abyss he encountered is not the transcendental, but the empirical, right? He looks at the empirical and he saw something so deep that cannot be conditioned by the transcendental. So the abyssal structure actually belongs to the empirical.
So I mean, I would say that's a good question, actually. I mean, it's difficult because precisely the idea of the abyss there is, you're right, it's about the failure of achieving a condition or securing a condition, a sufficient condition or a sufficient reason to make the deduction work. But, and you know, he cheats, Kant cheats. The real abyss, however, we want to localize where it is actually the imagination. So if we want to localize its precise location, it's the transcendental imagination. Kant has to cheat because in order to secure the commensurability between sensibility and the understanding, between the categories and the empirical, the data of the senses, he introduces this quote unquote third faculty, which at the end is nothing but the understanding functioning as a surrogate in intuition itself already, without which intuition would prove to be not only formless, right, but there could be no commensurability between the categories on the one hand and the forms of space and time, the forms of intuition. And we'll see exactly how he cheats precisely in this point. There's a series of sort of displacements that occur between the first and the second edition of the Transcendental Deduction, the A and B editions of the Transcendental Deduction. And of course, much of this, I heard many of you express an interest or express that some of your work relates to this concept, which of course is at the core of especially the second edition of the Transcendental Deduction, which is the unity of apperception, right? The transcendental unity of apperception, which is the highest, the most sort of glorified concept, the most important concept in Kant's theory of synthesis. In other words, in Kant's account of how it is that the faculties yield in their harmonious collaboration with each other, something like a cognition, a kenes, right? Like a representation of the world, an objective representation of the world. Any other comments, thoughts, questions?
Yeah.
Why do you call that cheating? Sorry, Matthews. I'm just interested why Daniel uses the term cheating, but I guess that would be clarified, no?
It will be clarified, yes. I mean, I mean, that's one of the questions, which is what did Kant want to accomplish in the Transcendental Deduction? Why does he have to change the structure of the deduction from A to B editions? And does he succeed, right? It's generally agreed upon that he doesn't succeed. In fact, there's a very important book by Henry Allison, who is considered to be widely, the most important living Kant scholar for good reasons. And he wrote a long book just on the history of the Transcendental Deduction, and how it is that, from Kant's earliest texts and his doctoral dissertation and so on and so forth, all his sort of formation shapes the arrival to the Transcendental Deduction. And he finally makes the argument that the Transcendental Deduction fails and had to fail. That, in other words, it's not possible to correct it in principle. And the reasons he gives for that, I don't think are entirely satisfactory, but we will get to talk about that in a little bit.
Yeah, sorry, Daniel. I think it's not, I think we'll get there when you start exploring Kant a bit deeper, but I think that one thing that got into my mind during the reading of the Transcendental Deduction was exactly this point in which suddenly the transcendental unity of apperception is like ready, and he starts saying that it is the most fundamental a priori for all cognition, but he had already said that the transcendental imagination was necessary for the transcendental unity. So you have the transcendental imagination as a necessary step for something that is necessary for any possible cognition. And I don't know, that was something that stood in my mind.
That is extremely, that's very much on the right track. That's exactly right. I mean, you touch on exactly the point of tension, which is, in the first edition, it's very clear that you have first this weird thing called the synopsis of sensibility, which we presume, he doesn't go into that because it's presumably just the way that sensibility is, or the sensory manifold is given to us in pure immediacy. And then he goes through these three series of synthetic powers, which of course are apprehension, reproduction, and finally apperception. But then in the B edition, he begins with apperception, saying that that's the big boy, right? Like that's the real concept that makes everything hang together, and the most important concept that secures the correlation between the I think, the pure subject, and the X, the transcendental object. But that turns out to require the labor of the imagination, not the reproductive labor of the imagination, which is what he identifies in the A edition as the empirical use of the imagination, how it is that we learn to associate and reproduce apprehended images, but the productive imagination, the primary and constitutive role of the productive imagination. And it is this primary and productive role of the transcendental imagination, or the pure imagination, which of course delivers us to the theory of the schematism in Kant, but also is the moment where the transcendental imagination becomes itself identified as the origin of all synthesis. But this origin of all synthesis, which is the transcendental imagination, is also identified by Kant himself as an effect of the understanding on intuition. So it is the understanding functioning in a special way. And of course, one of the things we have to ask is, and this is, I mean, I'm leaping really far ahead, right? I'm almost like spoiling the story here. But of course, the question is if we want to ask the question about why is Kant cheating, right? Is precisely because once he has to appeal to the transcendental imagination, all of a sudden the categories come back through the back door. But that was precisely what he had to secure. He had to ground the applicability of the categories to intuition. And what he does is just smuggles them in to the structure of intuition themselves through the transcendental imagination. And we'll see how he does this, right? It's very clever, but it doesn't, you know, at the end of the day, Allison is right, and everybody, I mean, I think every commentator, serious reader of Kant will have noticed that happens in the B edition very clearly, right? And it's beautiful because you see Kant really struggle, right? This is the moment in which it's almost like everything that happens after in the three critiques is sort of like an attempt to just say, okay, that didn't happen, right? It's almost like you're in a relationship and something, you know, they cheat on you. Let's forget about that and just move on. Like it's something like that. It's like sort of covering the dirt. You know? There's a couple of questions I think or a question. Sede asked, does the bridging abyss refer to the operation of schematization and synthesis? Well, yes, exactly. I mean, like the abyss is precisely what happened, or rather to ameliorate the abyss or to amend this sort of like, you know, casting us over into the abyss of the transcendental imagination would be precisely something like securing a foundation for synthesis. But that's what Kant cannot do. So Kant, and this is the locution abyss, incidentally, is, I'm borrowing it directly from Heidegger's reading, right? Heidegger describes Kant's descent to the transcendental imagination as a kind of sort of confrontation with the abyss of being, where the resources of transcendental logic become voided. And I'll say a few words about this. Those of you who were in, I think it was the Analytics and Continentals seminar that I taught a few time ago. I spoke a little bit about transcendental logic and the importance of understanding what that means. And I will get into that as soon as we get to Kant, because that's one of the first concepts that we'll.
Daniel, Arman is raising hands.
Sure. Yes.
Actually, I raised my hand, but because I noticed that somebody else also had a question, I wanted them to go first, but I don't see them. Anyway, if nobody has a question, I wanted just to ask, maybe ask a question and spoil further our scenario, or should we wait? Because I want to ask a question about the transcendental unity, but it's into Kant. Can I ask it? Is that okay?
I mean, I think we'll get there soon enough, and maybe let's wait and see if it makes sense.
Sure.
You know, and if it does, then yeah, we'll tackle it head on. I mean, how are we doing with time? We're doing good. Any other questions or comments, or are we good to move? We're good to move. All right, great. So with that said, let's start getting into Kant. And what I'll try to do is, before we get into the concrete, discussion of this structure of what we read for the transcendental deduction, I will say a few words about the structure of the critical project, the first critique, just for those of us who do not have background on Kantian philosophy and philosophy more generally. because if not, it will become a little bit difficult. Obviously, we couldn't read everything from the beginning to the transcendental deduction. That would have been impracticable. So let me just return to 1 second. Ta-da. Are we all seeing the PowerPoint again? Yes, great. Okay, cool. So I'm going to skip a few things. Here's a very short quote from Schopenhauer, a very famous quote from Schopenhauer, where he defines or tries to define the transcendental method as it's born in Kant. And I think it's just a helpful point of departure. And then we'll start with Kant's introduction to the transcendental method. Now, in the first place, Kant understands by transcendental the recognition of the a priori, and thus merely formal element in our knowledge as such. In other words, the insight that such knowledge is independent of experience, indeed prescribes for this even the unalterable rule whereby it must turn out. It's not the clearest locution in the world, I get, but we'll get to this. Such insight is bound up with the understanding why such knowledge is this and has this power, namely because it constitutes the form of our intellect, and thus in consequence of its subjective origin. Transcendental, and this is really the important locution. The previous one is very obscure, badly written, but this one's better. Transcendental is the philosophy that makes us aware of the fact that the first and essential laws of this world that are presented to us are rooted in our brain and are therefore known a priori. It is called transcendental because it goes beyond the whole given phantasmagoria to the origin thereof. Therefore, as I have said, only the critique of pure reason and generally the critical, that is to say, Kantian philosophy, are transcendental. Now, I think this is wrong on many, many levels, right? And there's no surprise. Schopenhauer is not the most subtle of readers. But one thing that is sort of easy to get us, to get us started, is this locution that, I mean, you can read Schopenhauer almost like even the worst reader can come up with this sort of reading, which is transcendental is the philosophy that makes us aware of the fact that the first and essential laws of this world that are presented to us are rooted in our brain or mind, use mind here, right? Like roughly, and are therefore known a priori. Okay, but Schopenhauer is wrong for a variety of reasons, and we don't have to worry about those yet, right? We'll get to them in short notice. So here comes the introduction, the beginning and the definition of the transcendental. And the first distinction that we have to draw is between empirical knowledge and what Kant calls pure knowledge. So empirical knowledge is, of course, knowledge that is what is usually called a posteriori, is knowledge that is considered to be obtained from experience, that requires and is dependent upon experience. Pure knowledge, in contrast, is a priori. It is independent of sensory experience. But of course, one of the things that we know, that we will all have known, is that Kant is engaged not just in an investigation of a priori knowledge, but is specifically a kind of a priori knowledge, which he names synthetic a priori knowledge, right, as opposed to analytic. And what synthetic a priori knowledge or synthetic a priori judgments finally will turn out to involve are precisely judgments concerning the invariant structures of all possible experience. So pure knowledge, in the sense that Kant is engaged or exploring or chasing after, concerns the search for the conditions of all possible empirical knowledge. So even though pure knowledge is not empirical, right? It's not one more fact that you collect from empirical intuition. It nevertheless lays out the invariant conditions that structure all possible empirical knowledge. So it is an exploration of the conditions. And we understand here from the very get-go that this understanding of the pure conditions has to do with a delimitation of the faculty through which empirical knowledge is possible. And this is the faculty of the understanding for Kant. The faculty of the understanding is the faculty, he will say, of, first of all, what he associates with the spontaneity of the mind or of thinking. Thinking is spontaneously active in the sense that it is not only receptive, we do not only receive data from the senses in a passive manner, but we actively interpret it. We actively organize and structure it. And therefore, this structuration of the sensory manifold is part of a quote unquote, and Kant uses the term, functional dynamics. The understanding is the way in which the sensory manifold that is given to us in the forms of space and time become functionally bound by or to concepts, which is what the understanding provides. So the understanding is the faculty of providing concepts through which we functionally coordinate or structure the forms of intuition, i.e., the data of the senses, into cognitions, empirical cognitions. So long story short, what is the minimal Kantian characterization of experience? All experience is a synthesis of intuition and concept, of sensibility that we receive, of course, precisely as the forms of space and time, right? And concepts that provide these forms of space and time with a specific conceptual form or shape. This already tells us why there's a kind of, there's an important distinction to be drawn, and everybody should always remember to draw this distinction between the forms of intuition and the categories of the understanding, right? It's very easy to sort of use this vocabulary as Schopenhauer does, for example, when he speaks of the forms of the intellect. Well, strictly speaking, when Kant speaks of form, he's speaking of sensibility and the endowments and the structuration of space and time. So that belongs to the transcendental aesthetic. The categories of the understanding, the exploration of the pure concepts through which we synthesize intuitions, is what is precisely explored in the transcendental analytic, and that pertains to the function or the functioning of the understanding, the faculty of knowledge. Now, another thing to note here, propedeutically, is interestingly how approximate this is in its sort of spirit already to Plato, right? There's a kind of Platonism here, which is the idea, the pursuit of pure concepts, or the pure concepts of the understanding. If everybody has, if you remember in the Republic, the journey through the divided line, the ascent to the realm of the forms, right? It is precisely, what is Plato chasing after? He's precisely engaged in this sort of attempt to, first of all, purify philosophy, to remove itself away from the domain of simulacra, of copies, and to ascend to those concepts which for him are precisely those that structure the world of the visible. But those are of dialectical and formal nature, right? Ultimately, for Plato, these are given to us by mathematics, right? Geometry, of course. And Plato stipulates, if you remember, those of you who have read Republic, right? Plato arrives at the height of his exploration of what he anticipates as the domain of the forms, which is a domain of pure mathematical idealities. He says, we, however, lack something. We lack, as of yet, a science of motion. We do not have a mathematics of motion that is in place. But of course, and this is something that we explored in my previous seminar, one of the things that happens in modern science, right, precisely Newtonian mechanics, as a kind of quote unquote mathesis universalis, is precisely an attempt to provide us with precisely what Plato wanted, a mathematics or a science of motion. And one of the things, the reason why I'm bringing this up now is because when Kant speaks of the forms of intuition, these forms, he's using the term form in a strict Platonic sense. They are forms insofar as they're mathematically structured. And we will see, well, we won't get to see actually, but this mathematical structuration of the forms of intuition correspond to very specific paradigms. In the structuration of space, we have, of course, Newtonian mechanics and geometry, and in the structuration of time, we have arithmetic, which is the form of succession. Here we have a first quote, which Kant gives in the definition of the transcendental, and I'll go through three introductory quotes that define the concept as it is first elaborated. And what follows, therefore, we shall understand by a priori knowledge, not knowledge independent of this or that experience, but knowledge absolutely independent of all experience. Opposed to it is empirical knowledge, which is knowledge possible only a posteriori, that is, through experience. A priori modes of knowledge are entitled pure when there is no admixture of anything empirical. Now, this must, of course, be always taken with a caveat, which is, sure, They are pure, they do not pertain to this or that empirical cognition, but they specify the conditions of possibilities of all empirical cognition, right? So that's the missing bit here. But here we get the second code. This one's already a little bit more precise. If we eliminate from our experiences everything which belongs to the senses, there still remain certain original concepts and certain judgments derived from them, which must have arisen completely a priori, independently of experience, inasmuch as they enable us to say, or at least lead us to believe that we can say, in regard to the objects which appear to the senses, more than mere experience would teach, giving to assertions true universality and strict necessity, such as mere empirical knowledge cannot supply. This is the second point, which is Kant here is implicitly responding, as many of you probably know, to Hume, and by extension to the perils, to the skeptical perils to which the empiricist theory of knowledge formation led. Long story short, for those of us who are rusty with our Hume is led to skeptical waters when precisely grounding the concept of natural necessity. That, of course, is necessary to explain things such as the laws of nature, right? Why? Because the empiricist theory of concept formation and of knowledge implies that all knowledge derives from intuition, i.e. from sensibility, and therefore that if it is the case, in fact, that all knowledge is based on an extrapolation on what is perceptible or perceived or has been perceived at some point in time, then nothing really grounds the postulation of a necessary rule that guarantees that the future will resemble the past. Hume famously says, I see, the example of the sun rising every day is the classical example, and it's simple enough to follow. I see the sun rise today, I see the sun rise tomorrow, I see the sun rise the day after, and so on and so forth. I see a certain regularity habitually by nature. I extrapolate inductively from this habitual associations, right? And I say, oh, there's this lawfulness to nature. The sun rises every day necessarily, always, right? And Hume simply makes the observation that, if we are in rigor, we have no grounds to say, in fact, we know that there is a necessary law that makes it the case that tomorrow the sun will rise. We believe it will be the case by association of impressions. We believe it to be the case by extrapolating from perceived instances. But in fact, this concept of necessity that is necessary to ground the notion of natural lawfulness is strictly speaking unwarranted or unjustified. And those of you, this might seem like an arcane problem that would have been sort of like brushed aside in the course of history and maybe was, relevant, in 17th century, but no, actually this problem keeps haunting philosophy again and again. It's today associated with the quote unquote problem of modality. And those of you who are more familiar with the analytic tradition will know, for example, that the very same problems about concerning the cogency and the epistemic legitimacy of modal concepts of necessity, possibility, and so on, resurface in the 20th century after the logical empiricist sequence, for example, in the work of Quine, who raises challenges precisely to the synthetic analytic distinction, but also to the concepts of necessity. Anyway, that's just to say this is, Kant here is obviously attempting not only to distill pure concepts of the understanding, but these pure concepts, insofar as they structure all possible empirical cognitions, would precisely provide something like what Hume was missing, which is a foundation to establish how it is that appearances are necessarily structured in relations of specific associations, causal consequence being one of them, of course, but not exclusively. As you know, causation, cause and effect, is one of the categorical forms or categories, right? But it's not the only one. And here's the concrete definition, and there's two actual definitions here of transcendental philosophy as Kant understands it. First, I entitle transcendental all knowledge which is occupied not so much with objects as with the mode of our knowledge of objects, insofar as this mode of knowledge is to be possible a priori. A system of such concepts might be entitled transcendental philosophy. Second, transcendental philosophy is only the idea of a science for which the critique of pure reason has to lay down the complete architectonic plan. That is to say, it has to guarantee, as following from principles, the completeness and certainty of the structure in all its parts. It is the system of all principles of pure reason. It's beautiful, right? It's a very beautiful sort of ambition, and you cannot be more ambitious than this. But it already tells us a couple of things that are important to carry out. A, in its inception, transcendental philosophy is bound to the systematic ideal of philosophy as a system of principles that are presumably structuring the domain of a priori knowledge. That's number one. Number two, this system of principles constitutes a science. It is a scientific enterprise, as Kant conceives it, right? And it's a very strange science, because this means that there's not only empirical science, as we normally think, right? That science is a domain of empirical inquiry, but there is such a thing as transcendental science, or a transcendental, inquiry that counts as a science, or a science of pure knowledge, which is again another beautiful idea, or a beautiful locution. And third, this system or science of pure knowledge structures itself as the system of principles of pure reason, right? And of course, the question then becomes, why reason? Why does reason hold this prerogative in this story, right? Why is it that reason is, after all, the subject matter of the critique, as opposed to, say, for example, why is it not the critique of pure knowledge, or the pure understanding, or the pure forms of intuition, right? Why is this prerogative given to reason? And this will have to do with the question of the deduction, of course, right? Which is also the moment in which we cross from the analytic scope of the transcendental analytic to the dialectic as well. So here we have also another indication, which is that this exploration of transcendental philosophy is not only bound to the question of pure knowledge, but it's bound to these other three central concepts: God, freedom, and immortality. And obviously, this is very obtuse at this moment. Like, we have no idea how it is that the question of pure knowledge will lead us to these lofty questions concerning practical reason, or the existence of God, or questions about the mortality or immortality of the soul, and so on and so forth. But that's where Kant wants to go. And it's always important to know that when you see in transcendental philosophy, since we're playing detective, right? And transcendental philosophers are playing detective with their predecessors, always saying, aha, you see, here you were carrying such and such prejudice that you did not detect. In order to realize what it is that the transcendental philosopher we're reading is harboring as an undetected or unstated assumption, ask yourself always the question, what does this philosopher really want? What is he or she chasing after, right? What is at the end of the tunnel for them? And because at the end of the day, Kant, it's very clear that it's not only trying to salvage the project of, pure reason for its own sake. It's because he's trying to salvage the possibility of a rational theology, really. In other words, that is to say, the possibility of a rationally adjudicated sort of system of principles that would guarantee knowledge and belief, or justify belief in God and the immortality of the soul, and a validation of the Christian doctrine, right? So it is really, after all, the scholastic and the theological impetus behind the text cannot be elided. And in fact, that we already noticed this earlier on, that there is a kind of uncanny, reverberation running throughout this history of transcendental philosophy and theology. And one of the things I want to explore is precisely this quote unquote theological impetus that runs underneath the attempt to purify ourselves from the empirical, which of course already in its locution has almost the structure of, kind of like a penitentiary sort of cleansing of oneself from all sin or something. So the problem of pure reason is finally, how are synthetic a priori judgments possible, right? So this reiteration of the priority of the a priori will finally be condensed in the question, how are synthetic a priori judgments possible, which breaks down, Kant tells us in the introduction, to two subsidiary questions. How is pure mathematics possible, and how is a pure science of nature possible? The other thing that Kant is trying to do is, of course, trying to make philosophy and this system of rational principles commensurate to Newtonian mechanics, to the birth of modern science. So really, at the end of the tunnel, what Kant is trying to do is to render compatible a rational theology with the principles of Newtonian mechanics, with the new science, with the new mathesis universalis. So the question then is why, why does this particular question concerning the structure of synthetic a priori judgments break down to pure mathematics and to a pure science of nature? And this will turn out to be important because, as you probably all know, for Kant, mathematics is not just pure empty knowledge, it gives us knowledge of the forms of space and time itself. Geometry and arithmetic structure the forms of intuition themselves, which is why the forms of intuition are forms that are studied by precisely mathematical cognition. So this leads us, now that we have the basic question, synthetic a priori, an exploration to the structure of synthetic a priori judgments, we have a subsidiary question, which is, how does this knowledge become possible or is given to us as a result of the harmonious contribution of the faculties? So this is, of course, what begins the critique of pure reason, which is an exploration into the different kinds of faculties. Transcendental is not only a kind of knowledge, but transcendental comes to qualify a particular form of operation of the different faculties that jointly compose experience. And we have already spoken a little bit about this, but of course there are two primary faculties that Kant identifies. And then there's this third faculty, which at the end turns out to be somehow of a ambiguous third thing, which is the imagination. But the two major ones are, of course, sensibility and the understanding. And the connection or the synthesis between the two of them is precisely what Kant calls representation. So the transcendental aesthetic is, of course, the exploration into the forms of intuition, that is to say, the receptivity of the senses, whereas the transcendental analytic is a study of the categories of the understanding, thinking, the spontaneity of thinking, and which Kant tells us is both functional and conceptual in nature. And by conceptual, he means discursive. The categories of the understanding are concepts, pure concepts, that also specify or are correlated with forms of judgment. So as you all know, probably the table of categories corresponds to a table of judgments, so that for every category, there corresponds a possible class of judgments. So of course, the question is synthetic a priori judgments, right? At the end of the day, it's the question of synthetic a priori judgments that is under investigation here. Now, to make this very precise or more precise, the forms of intuition, as I mentioned, are structured mathematically. Space and time are the two forms of intuition. Space constitutes the form of outer sense, and that is precisely what is the object of physics, right? Physics is the exploration of what we quote unquote call the external or objective world, and that is the study of what Kant will eventually call extended magnitudes. That is to say, the study of bodies as they are extended in space with properties such as, for example, mass, volume, weight, and so on and so forth. The other form of intuition is time, and that is the form of what Kant calls inner sense, and that is actually part of our psychological nature or psychological science. Time belongs to psychology. Time is the way that objective representations are structured by the mind in a quote unquote relationship of succession. So we intuit objective representations in physical space as extended bodies with extended properties or properties that are measured by extended magnitudes, right? Volume, mass, size, etc. But these representations are organized diachronically in succession, and the organization or the ordering of representations is what is formally understood or studied by arithmetical mathematics. Arithmetic is the science of succession, and therefore is the science of understanding chronology, time. It gives us the form of time. And of course, this is also, and Heidegger will make a fuss about this, of course. He'll say that in Kant's rational psychology, as he calls it himself, there is already, you can see here already in the forms of intuition, a kind of unstated metaphysical caprice. Why? Because of course, Kant here already tells us quite a bit about what he believes time is. And as you know, Heidegger makes a big fuss about how it is that philosophers, since the Greek beginning, have reified the form of presence, right? A metaphysics of presence runs through the history of philosophy. And unfortunately, Kant does not escape such form of presence. How is this form of presence manifested in Kant? Well, we'll see that more next week, but you can already see here in the conception of of time as succession, as chronological succession, as a succession of instants studied by arithmetic, he identifies, therefore, time and being in time as subsistence. Objects, represented objects, physical objects, subsist in time insofar as precisely you organize them in this chronological succession or this ordering of instants. But because everything is understood thus as intratemporal subsistent being, right, subsistence, there's a substance metaphysics at work already in the forms of intuition, Heidegger will argue. And so this is important because, of course, this means that the metaphysical pollution is not only on the end of the understanding. We already can see it here in the structuration of the forms of intuition. The other thing to be said here, something that is, I've mentioned in many of my seminars, but something that's important is that you can see here something that especially Deleuze and Wilfrid Sellers and others have said about Kant, which is Kant has the unfortunate tendency, partially because he doesn't know what he's doing, but he's trying to do something that he cannot do. But he has the unfortunate tendency to identify as universal invariant conditions of experience empirical, contingent theoretical conditions. So in the case of, for example, his understanding of space or the form of space as outer sense, I've already mentioned that he has a specific understanding of this as geometrical, right? Geometry studies the form of outer sense, but he has Euclidean geometry in mind, and he has Newtonian mechanics as his understanding of physical space. But of course, we understand now that Euclidean geometry is not the only geometry possible, that there are post-Euclidean geometries. We understand that Newtonian mechanics is not the be and end all of all mechanics or physics, right? So therefore, the question becomes, Kant seems to identify Newtonian mechanics as invariant transcendental structures, Euclidean geometry as invariant transcendental structures of space. To what extent is this so? Well, it appears he was wrong. He's reifying a contingent geometrical and scientific mechanistic paradigm as a kind of transcendental structure. But that's also a metaphysical conceit, right? If it is the case, in fact, that he's doing that. There's a big discussion in the literature about whether Kant is, in fact, guilty of having promoted something like a universalization of Euclidean geometry. Henry Allison is also part of this debate, but it's actually a very scholastic debate, so I'm not going to get into that. The other thing that's important here is that what I anticipated a moment ago, and I'll stop because I think there's a few questions or comments in a little bit. There's this issue of what is a transcendental logic and why the transcendental system of principles of a priori knowledge or pure knowledge, whatever you want to call it, at the end constitutes something like that deserves to be called a transcendental logic. The philosopher Sebastian Rödl, I don't actually know how you pronounce his name, but Rödl, anyway, has written a very important book, which is Categories of the Temporal, where he very, very succinctly in the introduction identifies the distinction between formal logic and transcendental logic. Formal logic is what we understand basically in the form of a calculus of pure principles of deduction of cognition, like what Frege called a calculus of, a calculus of pure thought, a calculus of pure thinking. So that's what we understand by formal logic. Simple, the forms of the syllogism, that is to say, the forms of reasoning or thinking unbound from any kind of possible experience. Now, transcendental logic tries to derive or to secure the principles of thinking insofar as they relate to intuition. So that's what makes it transcendental properly, because it's not pure logic or formal logic, but transcendental logic, because the principles or the pure categories in the end and the forms of intuition are, the pure categories, the categories of the understanding, structure and are correlated to the forms of intuition and of our sensibility. So therefore, these are forms of experience. Transcendental logic tries to investigate the invariant principles and laws of all possible experience, and that's what makes it distinguished. So the transcendental aesthetic is, of course, essential and central. Here's a very brief sort of illustration, of course, of both the table of judgments and the table of categories. I'll send the PDF after the PDF, the PowerPoint after, so that you can see these in more substantive detail. In case it's always helpful to be, to have these side by side. But just one thing I will say here, there's a couple of things that are important. The first one is that, as you can see, the category of cause and dependence, cause and effect, causality, it specifically belongs to the third table, which is that of relationality. And it's one of the categories among others. It's not privileged in this other way. The other thing that's important, and we will see this in short notice, actually, this is where things start to get really tricky, okay? Here's the first curveball that is difficult to understand. When we ask how it is that these categories correspond to the forms of intuition, which, remember, we have already said are structured in terms of two mathematical paradigms, geometry and arithmetic, space and time, right? There will be a correlation drawn specifically between two of these tables or two of these subsets and the forms of intuition. Specifically, time will correspond or will be correlated to the categories of quality, whereas space will be correlated with the categories of quantity. And this will be investigated specifically, or correspondingly, time in what he calls the anticipations of perception, and then space in relation to quantity in what Kant calls the axioms of intuition. And then, of course, there's corresponding to modality and relation, the analogies of experience. The doctrine of the faculties. So there's two questions here that we want to ask, and I'll stop right after this slide just for decanting this, just propedeutic. So if, in fact, so here's a methodological question that we should be asking Kant right from the get-go. Why does the question of the search for synthetic a priori judgments, why is there a priority accorded from the get-go to the understanding, it seems, as opposed to the forms of intuition? Why are we searching for pure concepts, right? Why is this not a critique of pure intuition? Why is it a critique of pure reason? I already asked this question before, but there seems to be a priority accorded to reason and to the understanding, right? And of course, there's a question about how reason develops from the understanding. We will get into that later. But why the priority accorded to thinking as opposed to intuition? And this is the problem that Kant will ultimately have to face and will not be able to answer for us, which is, finally, the forms of intuition have to correspond to the categories for there to be the possibility of a logic, of a transcendental logic. There has to be a way to coordinate these pure concepts of the understanding to the forms of intuition. These forms of our receptivity must be able to be coordinated to the forms of our spontaneity or thinking. But this is precisely what the theory of synthesis will try to do. If all experience is a synthesis of intuition and understanding, then therefore we need an account of how this is possible itself. So we do not only need an analytic catalog of the different faculties that we have, i.e. sensibility, i.e. the understanding, but we need an account of how these faculties communicate with each other, how they come in contact with each other. And furthermore, in what sense can we say, with what authority can we say, that in fact the forms of intuition are already somehow commensurate to the categories of the understanding insofar as they correspond precisely to the determinations of quantity and quality before there is anything quite as lofty as judgment in place, right? The idea is that these forms of intuition of our sensibility are already in themselves mathematically structured. It's not that we structure them once we acquire late in the history of human evolution, right, and theoretical cognition, mathematical concepts. They're presumably in themselves already formally structured in geometrical and arithmetical form. So the question is then, how do we know this? How can we determine that these forms of intuition belong already to the forms of our sensibility before we have the concepts? And this is what Kant will ultimately not be able to tell us, right? Because he's cheating. Again, he is reifying contingent theoretical paradigms and a contingent understanding of space as an invariant transcendental structure. So the transcendental deduction will be precisely an attempt to sort out this mess, to tell us how it is that synthesis occurs, and to tell us how it is that intuition, sensibility itself, is already structured by precisely the labor of this undercover agent of the understanding called the transcendental imagination. Let me stop there for 1 second to make sure there's questions and so on. But Danielle was really reminds me of a Bergsonian critique of Kant. Yes, and there's I mean, of course, poor Kant has been a punching bag ever since Kant wrote, right? So he has been critiqued for a variety of reasons, and there's really no end to, you know, at every turn of the way, you can find something that Kant can be charged for, which I think is both interesting in its own right, just because you can, you know, take this very far, but it's also highly redundant. You know, the Bergsonist critique of Kant overlaps tremendously with Hegel's critique of Kant and Heidegger's critique of Kant and Deleuze's critique of Kant and everyone's critique of Kant. Everybody grabs Kant as guilty of basically being a metaphysician and a theologian, a theological metaphysician undercover. And of course, they're right. What's interesting, really, and the reason why we still read Kant with such sort of rigor and passion is because despite this sort of betrayal or this failure, whatever you want, right? There seems to be something that he's looking after that philosophy cannot avoid if in fact it can survive at all. And we'll get to that precisely. I mean, the question of the imagination is really where all comes crumbling into pieces, I think. But yeah, any questions? I mean, I've been like moving really fast, obviously just trying to get our basic count down, but with specific reference to duration in Bergson as opposed to the continuation of time. Well, yes, exactly. I mean, one of the things that is interesting in the Bergsonist account is how the notion of pure duration no longer corresponds to simply the form of quantitative succession, as Kant understands. And you know, pure duration is precisely this quote unquote. This has to do with, yes, quality for Bergson, but later it will have to do with, in Deleuze's case, for example, with an exploration of intensities, which are no longer qualitative, purely speaking, intensive magnitudes. But it's very interesting because Kant already here, in the separation between space and time, and therefore in the separation between the axioms of intuition and the anticipations of perception, already distinguishes between intensive and extensive magnitudes. Extensive magnitudes, again, being those magnitudes that gives us relations of quantity, such as mass, volume, weight, and so on. Intensive magnitudes giving us measures of intensity in the sense of not more or less quantity, but more or less intensely, right? Like higher volume, pitch, pressure, and so on and so forth. For those of you who know more about Deleuze than anything else, you know, Manuel de Landa, right, likes to routinely emphasize this distinction between extensive and intensive properties and magnitudes, but it's already there in Kant. So you can see it in the anticipations of perception and the axioms of intuition. Let's see. Kant is useful in as much as critique as pedagogical tradition, retain the world, you know, metaphysical models. Well, yes, I mean, and at the end, we're going to see just how bad the pollution goes in short notice, but it's a metaphysics, you know, and there's so much. It's all metaphysics. There's actually a letter a very famous letter, or infamous letter, I should say, I guess, between Kant and Marcus Hirst from I don't remember the date exactly, but I have it somewhere. And Kant there is writing. And it's very interesting when you read these letters, Kant's letters, because one thing you notice is he gets to say things that he cannot say in the book because he like the rabbit would be out of the hat, as it were, right? So in this letter to Marcus Hirst, you see Kant say something like, "What I'm doing is really a metaphysics of metaphysics, or a metaphysics of the subject." So he admittedly declares that there's no getting away from metaphysics in a way, right? So one thing that we will see actually is that in this radicalization of the transcendental in weeks to come, one of the questions that we will raise is, of course, to what extent is this project of laying the foundations or ground of metaphysics as a propedeutic inquiry, call it transcendental epistemology or later phenomenology or whatever, possible? Can we in fact step outside metaphysics? Or is it that we can only negotiate with metaphysics from within, right? That we are, regardless, already installed within metaphysics, so that there's no stepping away from through a propedeutic inquiry, whether this be epistemological, phenomenological, historical, or whatever. In fact, one of the things, if Romina's still here, she might crucify me for saying this, but Derrida, is often, I don't know if charged, but credited with the insight that you negotiate with metaphysics from within, that there's no exit from metaphysics, right? Any questions, comments, thoughts?
Yeah, I had a question, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Yeah, I was wondering, what do you think about, the whole debate about, Kantian conceptualism and non-conceptualism? McDowell talks about, he says that in the, I think, as you said, in the fifth edition of the Critique, when Kant actually transforms his way of talking, he actually means that there is actually nothing called sense impression or intuition. All the intuitions are already conceptual. In the final analysis, all experiential content is conceptual content. McDowell actually, he rephrases that a little bit. He says, in the previous, in Mind and Will, he says, all conceptual, all intuitive content are propositional content, full-blown propositional content with judgment. But in the later book, I think he changed his tone. He says, no, not propositional, but conceptual, because the difference between judgments and concepts. So I was wondering, what do you think about this?
Well, I think he's right about Kant, but Kant wouldn't want to admit that, right? So the idea is, McDowell is right precisely precisely that's what's problematic about Kant, and also with McDowell, incidentally. I mean, among many other things, but the idea is that the forms of intuition are already somehow conceptual in nature, is precisely what Kant will eventually say when he smuggles in the structuration of the forms of intuition by the schematism, by the transcendental imagination. And then you see that there are, as Wilfrid Sellars calls it, these absolutely determinedly basic this-suches that structure the field of intuition. In other words, intuition is already objectified in accordance with the concepts and the categories of the understanding by the labor of the imagination. So therefore, they are already somehow conceptual in shape. But they are only conceptual in shape because there's this thing called a transcendental imagination operating, again, as an undercover agent for the understanding on intuition already in advance. So McDowell is totally right. I mean, and he's right to correct his earlier locution about saying that the forms of intuition are already propositional, because that would be to smuggle judgment into the schematism. But the schematism is really algorithmically rather than grammatically structured. Incidentally, if you're interested in this question in a much better text than anything that McDowell has written on the subject, there's a very important essay by Sellars called on Kant's role on the role of imagination in Kant's theory of experience, and that's in his collection Kant's Transcendental Idealism. I highly recommend you take a look at that.
It is a follow-up question, sorry, regarding this question. You mentioned Sellars that experience, in terms of such that's, in terms of no that's. I listened to a talk by Jim O'Shea. He was, he was debating this point. He said he differentiated between two types of conceptualism in Sellars. He calls one of them experiential content conceptualism, which McDowell advocates. All experiential content is conceptual content, but he says, Sellars is not an experiential. Sellars, like Kant, has some sort of non-conceptualism in terms of non-conceptualized intuition. So Sellars is not an experiential content conceptualist, but he's an epistemic conceptualist, as a follow-up, as a reference to the method of the given.
Yes, no, I'm familiar with that, with that point that Jim makes, and I think he's right. And I think his recoding of the Kantian distinction and how he conceives of the determinedly basic this such units corrects what's wrong about the Kantian account. So I'm actually, I think that Sellars does good on his on correcting the drift in Kant's conceptualist sort of the residual abstractionism that he has in his account of the forms of intuition. which Sellers identifies. He says there's this kind of almost Aristotelian abstractionism laden in Kant's account of the forms of intuition, when precisely he characterizes the structure of the schematism and of the individuals of experience, what he calls images, as determinately basic this such units that are categorically determined. And he will say that bit has to go. We have to let go of this abstractionist residue to give way to a more dynamic conception of science as, historically bound by a normative, self-realizing structure. And I think he's right about that, incidentally. And we'll get to talk about that in weeks to come. There's I think a question, or it's a quote. That's the JD reference. Oh, okay, great. Any other comments or thoughts? No?
Yeah, sure. I think there is also another one or two here in the questions, but mine was in the relation between the pure logic and the transcendental logic, because I think it is a bit confusing that Kant keeps on changing the names he's using for the same things, and I'm not sure if these two are the same thing or not, because sometimes they sound like they are, sometimes they don't. I don't know. So
sorry, which do you think?
Yeah, what if pure logic, when he speaks about pure logic, and he's trying to say that he's really trying to get to the purest conceptual structures, is the same thing as when he's talking about the transcendental logic, which you just said in the last slide, that it would be somewhat like the logic of experience itself. But is pure logic the same thing? Is that this sort of logic or not?
I mean, I don't recall if he uses the locution pure logic. I mean, transcendental. So the distinction I would draw is between formal logic and transcendental logic, right? I think that's the more easy distinction to keep track of. Kant might like the locution pure logic to refer to transcendental logic insofar as he can identify transcendental logic as an investigation into the pure concepts of the understanding, right? So to that extent, those two locutions would overlap. But I was trying to distinguish formal logic in the sense of a calculus, right, of pure thought, from transcendental logic, which is an exploration of the forms of thought insofar as they relate to the data of intuition, right, which is what Kant is after here. And yes, you were right. There's a couple of, I'm sorry, I missed a few questions. There's a question that is, what does Kant's views on time, space as inner sense and outer sense lead to? How is subjectivity constituted? Well, yes. I mean, of course, the idea is that, so intuition are the forms of our receptivities, what we get passively, right? But as it turns out, these forms of our receptivity already include a fair bit of structuration, right? They're not just like, it's not just raw data that we just get in a barrage of unformed like sort of inputs. It turns out to be quite structured, and it's structured precisely in this mathematical way in a spatio-temporal experience, as extended and intensive magnitudes, as having a geometrical and arithmetical form. So this is why, as Dolchat said a moment ago, another way to think about this is to think that, the forms of our receptivity are already pregnant with all sorts of activities and contributions from the understanding, right? So, even before we get to the transcendental analytic proper, which is how it is that pure thinking in its spontaneous contribution operates, comes into the picture, already the transcendental aesthetic turns out to be laden with all this stuff, right? Pregnant with all this structure and stuff. Another interesting question, I guess one could say is, there's a good sense in which we can say that Kant is already a kind of structural realist, right? Insofar as the forms of intuition are mathematically cognizable, they have mathematical form, right? And these mathematical paradigms obey specific, theoretical structures, i.e. geometrical, mechanistic, arithmetical, reality is kind of platonically structured. It has mathematical form, right, for Kant. It's not that he's not only an essentialist in the sense that he has this notion of the categories of the understanding as organizing a substance metaphysics, but he has also a sort of structural realism in view, insofar as the forms of intuition are organized in mathematical form, as mathematically formalized, right, or formalizable. Any other questions there?
Can I ask a related question to the last one?
Sure.
You said that experience or intuition content has the mathematical context or mathematical structuration. Wouldn't you say, and wouldn't Kant say, that actually mathematics and geometry is the residue of the transcendental aesthetics?
I don't know if residue, but he would definitely say that the transcendental aesthetic, is already, or that the forms of intuition that are explored within the transcendental aesthetic correspond to the study of both the analogies of experience, the anticipations of perception and the axioms of intuition that are studied by the pure concepts of quantity and quality.
But
right?
you see in Kant the Platonic idea that there is in reality mathematical beings.
Yes, absolutely. Or not, to be precise, not mathematical beings in the sense, he's not a Pythagorean. As far as I can tell, he's not saying that numbers are real, but he's saying that space and time are mathematically structured, right?
Yeah.
So that's not exactly the same thing. It's one thing to say that mathematical idealities exist as mind-independent beings, or that they're real in some ontologically robust sense. And it's another to say that reality, space and time have mathematical structure, right? To say that they have mathematical structure is simply to say that the forms of space and time correspond or are cognizable by mathematical cognition, or by formalized scientific mathematical cognition. Newtonian, in the case of Kant, Newtonian mechanics, of course, geometry, arithmetic, right? And post-Kantians may shove this around and say, oh, we can let's reconceive of the transcendental aesthetic so that the forms of intuition do not obey a mechanistic account of causation and Euclidean geometry, but let's reframe it within a quote unquote quantum mechanistic worldview and a post-Euclidean worldview. That has been done and explored, and we will actually see how that is done in some projects. Any particular references for studying non-Euclidean geometry in relation to this? I am leaning towards critiques from architectural humanities or even post-humanities. Well, I don't know any on top of my head. I know several references that frame the problem within the history of philosophy. And this tends to come out more and more in discussions. There's a very Henry Somers Hall is a very good commentator of Deleuze and Hegel, and in general, he has a book on Kant, on Hegel and Deleuze on representation. And the fourth chapter there is a chapter on how Deleuze appropriates post-Euclidean geometries for a reconceptualization of space in his account of his transcendental empiricism. But it goes over the basics of Gauss and Riemann and post-Euclidean geometries and their contribution to our understanding of space. So I would advise you to take a look at that. Maybe that's a good place to start. Other than that, I don't know any textbook references, but I can find out. Any other comments or questions? No? Okay, cool. So let's move on. We're already we're moving good. So let me share screen. Almost there. All right, great. So this is just to summarize what we've covered so far, right? So the connection between the forms of intuition and the categories is guaranteed and studied precisely under these two headings, the anticipations of perception and the axioms of intuition. So the axioms of intuition study the forms of space that correspond to the category of quantity and to the study of extensive magnitudes. And this is precisely what is given to us by Newtonian mechanics, right? And of course, its Euclidean geometrical paradigm. We have the anticipations of perception, which study the form of time. This corresponds to the category of quality and to the study of intensive magnitudes, which is formalized by arithmetic, and to the order of representations as succession, and is associated with the science of psychology as the form of inner sense. So that's a mouthful, but hopefully it's clear enough, right? This is the two. Oh, sorry. And this is just a more complete, mapping. As you can see here, quantity, right, corresponds to the axioms of intuition, as I mentioned, quality to the anticipations of perception. And then there's these other two correlations, which I haven't gotten into because they're not as relevant and they're subsidiary to these two primary ones, which are the subordination of modality in relation to the postulates of empirical thinking in general and to the analogies of experience, respectively. And we can talk more about that later, but that honestly, that takes us a little bit afield, and I don't think it's as relevant as the first two. So this remains, however, this corresponds. I mean, why is the transcendental deduction necessary? That's the next question, right? Why do we need a transcendental deduction? And because it seems like so far, okay, great. He has given us sort of an account of the forms of intuition, the categories of the understanding. He says that these correspond or match each other. But of course, what we just said a moment ago is clearly a problem, because Kant is supposedly trying to lay the conditions for metaphysical inquiry, but he's proceeded to describe the forms of intuition in this quote unquote already metaphysically robust sense corresponding to all these things that modern science tells us. And then the correspondence to the categories of the understanding and to quantity and quality are apparently surreptitious. So how is it that the forms of intuition are in fact structured in this way before we have anything like capacity to develop Newtonian mechanistic physics, which after all is a quite late cultural development in human history, right? So this is why he needs to actually show not only that the categories are invariant structures of experience and therefore quote unquote derivable, right? But furthermore, that the forms of intuition are already in accordance structured in accordance with the categories of the understanding. And that correspondence or commensurability is what the transcendental deduction will tell us. And this will eventually lead us into the theory of this schematism, which is of course what the labor of the imagination ultimately produces. Here's a quote that's an important quote that sets the stage about the role of the transcendental schema. Now, it is clear that there must be a third thing which must stand in homogeneity with the category on the one hand and the appearance on the other, and makes possible the application of the former to the latter. This mediating representation must be pure without anything empirical and yet intellectual on the one hand and sensible on the other. Such a representation is the transcendental schema. And as we will see, the transcendental schema is a rule for the application of a category to an intuition. So it will be the transcendental schematism, which is of course the labor of the imagination, which provides the necessary or the missing mediating seed to coordinate the forms of intuition with the categories of the understanding. We do not only have the categories and the forms being these mathematical structures and then the categories being these pure concepts, but we have rules for the application of the concepts to the intuitions. And these rules of application are schemas, what Kant calls schemas or schemata, right? Now, here's a quote actually from Henry Allison from the book that I mentioned on the transcendental deduction, where he clarifies, making a reference to Hendrick's reading, which is a very famous reading of Kant, which traces the rooting of Kant's system of philosophy in the juridical philosophical tradition of the scholastic period. And one thing that he notes here is that the sense in which we need to understand the term deduction is not strictly speaking the sense in which we speak of deduction, say in pure mathematics, but it is much more understood again in the juridical sense, in which deduction has to do with normative justificatory adjudication. It is something like a proof procedure, but one that does not have a syllogistic structure in the form of a proof in the sense of mathematics. So I'll just read the quote. The purpose of the deduction accords with Heinrich's well-known philological thesis that Kant's use of the term deduction was borrowed from the legal system of the Holy Roman Empire, where Deduction Rechtsschriften, correct me, I don't know how to, anyway, were writings issued by the parties involved in legal disputes, most of which involved territorial claims. In short, Kant understood by a deduction, not a deductive argument in the sense, again, that we understand something like a syllogistic proof, but rather an argument of whatever form that endeavors to justify a right to possess and use of something, which is the case of the transcendental deduction, which in the case of the transcendental deduction is a set of pure concepts of the understanding or categories. Indeed, Kant himself makes this quite clear when he writes, quote, and this is from not from the Kemp Smith translation. This is a different translation, so because I'm quoting from Allison, it's got to be a different one. Sorry. Jurists, when they speak of entitlements and claims, distinguish in a legal matter between the question about what is lawful, quid juris, and that which concerns the fact, quid facti. And since they demand proof of both, they call the first that which is to establish the entitlement or legal claim the deduction, end quote. That's from 84b 116. Now, this accords really well with those of you who are familiar with the Pittsburgh school of, or readings of German idealism, like, for example, what Brandom does with his reading of Kant and Reason and Philosophy. It accords marvelously well. But anyway, that's an important thing. Let me take a look at the chat briefly because I think there's like some action going on there that I want to make sure I'm not missing. Deduction sounds more like abduction. Was that Federico? I suspect that was Federico.
No, it was actually Felizardo.
Oh, okay. There we go.
No, sorry, that was me. And I know I'm not talking about abduction, philosophical abduction, but this kind of deductions just sounds like an appropriation of sorts, of a right to smuggle some stuff into this structure that he's trying to build. I'm sorry,
you know what?
trying to be funny.
That's a good. It's making me think about to what extent Kant's procedure makes a use of abductive reasoning, and even if he fails by his own standards or what he wanted to accomplish, is it not that what he does is ultimately follow a perfectly legitimate model of how it is that scientific theorization or cognition proceeds, which is by abductive reasoning, presenting a likely hypothesis as an explanatory schema for relating a set of correlations in natural events and so on, or phenomena. So you could present, or you could reconstruct Kant's use of deduction as actually covertly a use of abductive reasoning, right? And say, maybe to ameliorate, to alleviate the burden on the poor Kant, say that Kant in fact is not guilty. I mean, he thought he needed a deduction, but what he's doing is just fine, and it's all that you could do in the end, right? Something like that. I've seen something like that be pursued by some people. Kant is a thought criminal. I mean, he is definitely he's a man of faith. he's cheating a lot, which again is cute. How much he cheats. Any other claims? I think we're good, right? So yeah, let's go back to this. So the next thing to say is first a word about the distinction between the first and the second editions. We already said a little bit about the structure, right? In the first edition of the Transcendental Deduction, in the first version, in the A version, we have first a definition of a threefold power of synthesis. So first we have a definition of what he names the synapses of sensibility, which presumably pertain to the constitution of the receptivity of the sensory manifold as such. So this would be the most basic, quote unquote, structuration of experience, the synapses of sensibility, right? This is before synthesis. So synapsis is not synthesis. And then synthesis itself becomes split three ways, right? Into three constitutive operations or faculties or sub-faculties, if you will, which are, of course, apprehension, reproduction, and apperception, right? And each of these each of these three things, apprehension, reproduction, and apperception, correspond to a specific faculty, right? Or a specific operation, perception, the imagination, and pure apperception, finally. Each of these three has both an empirical and a transcendental use, right? So as we know, for example, so let's take the example of the imagination, right? The imagination has a empirical use in its reproductive use. Its empirical use is to associate formerly recollected apprehensions in memory, or to be able to, remember something that's not present, or to associate different representations that are presented to you at once. That's the reproductive use. The primary use, the pure use, is the transcendental schemata, the formation of rules of application that coordinate categories to the forms of intuition. And we'll see in a little bit how this works more closely. Apperception similarly has an empirical and a transcendental use. In its empirical use, it's simply a conceptual cognition, an empirical cognition of an empirical object, a recognition of an object. I see a red chair, I see a cat, whatever. In its pure or transcendental form, the unity or what Kant calls ultimately the transcendental unity of apperception, which is the height of synthesis, is the correlation between the transcendental object and the transcendental subject. The X and I think X, as the general form that accompanies all representations, or that structures all possible representations. And of course, just to complete the series, apprehension, right? Apprehension is just the apprehension of a discrete objective representation. In its empirical use, it would correspond to the apprehension of an image, what Kant ultimately calls an image, bilden. And in its pure use, it turns out to involve the labor of this schematism as well. This is where things become really tricky, because it turns out that perception and imagination, apprehension and reproduction, are interwoven. And Kant tells us as much, that in fact, that the labor of the imagination, which seems to come after perception, right, is already somehow at work in apprehension, in the structuration of images themselves. That the imagination is already necessary, in other words, to account for there being a form that is given to us as a representation of anything concrete whatsoever. So what's interesting in this regard is that in this series, in this jump from synapses, the synapses of sensibility, to the syntheses of experience, right? You already have at the first level, which is at the level of apprehension or perception, already the transcendental imagination doing structuration. And as we're going to know in the second edition, this effect or structuration carried out by the transcendental imagination in its primary or productive role, which is the schematism, is, as I mentioned already, an effect of the understanding on intuition. So you have this sliding into the forms of intuition of the understanding all the way through the transcendental imagination, right? Let's see, hold on, let me change that. So here's just like a hopefully a helpful schematization that helps us understand how it is that all of these three syntheses, or this three tripartite power of synthesis, is ultimately annexed to the productive imagination. And in fact, in the second edition, as you have noticed, when he begins, Kant changes the organization of the structure and begins with pure apperception, with the unity of apperception as the highest principle of synthesis. He tells us directly that apperception is the labor of the imagination, or the product of the pure imagination, and that it ultimately identifies the transcendental imagination as, he tells us, the origin of all synthesis, the origin of all synthesis. Let's have a few quotes that are going to tell us. This is from A117. But only the productive synthesis of the imagination can take place a priori. For the reproductive synthesis rests on conditions of experience. This is again distinguishing the empirical from the pure imagination, or the transcendental use of imagination. The principles of the necessary unity of the pure productive synthesis of the imagination prior to apperception is thus the ground of the possibility of all cognition, especially that of experience. Here, Kant is bordering on delirium. Now, since this latter sense is the ground of the possibility of all cognitions, that transcendental unity of the synthesis of the imagination is the pure form of all possible cognition, through which, therefore, all objects of possible experience must be represented a priori. It's the transcendental imagination. But the transcendental imagination is the understanding. It's just the understanding functioning without, it's Kant is wanting to have his cake and eat it. He cannot simply call the transcendental imagination the understanding or assimilate it wholesale, because that would be the same as saying that the world of the senses are somehow already discursively structured before there is anything like judgment or discourse at place. And that's not what he wants to say. But what he wants to say is that this structuration of the forms of intuition themselves, and therefore all synthesis, right? Therefore the commensurability between concepts and intuitions is given to us by the transcendental imagination in this labor or productive primary role. But that is just the understanding functioning as a surrogate, right? Like as an undercover agent. Now, this is why we have very quickly a series of problems that are detected. We've already detected a few of these, but this smuggling in or labor of the transcendental imagination is what, beginning with Hegel and Fichte and Schelling, everybody will take issue with. And there's two major ways to try to resolve the problem of Kant's metaphysical smuggling in of the transcendental imagination here. One is to say, okay, Kant cheated here. He introduced the transcendental imagination as a surrogate of the understanding. And at the end of the day, he needed to do this to guarantee the commensurability of the subject and the object, the forms of intuition and the categories of the understanding, finally, the unity of apperception. But he couldn't derive, in fact, the unity of apperception as he needed to do it. He needed, again, to smuggle in the imagination this way. So we can, in fact, correct Kant and perform something like a deduction of the unity of the ego or the I or the self or experience. Fichte tries to do this, of course, in his own way. Another one is to say Kant's metaphysically pregnant system does not rise to the scrutinies of a presuppositionless science, which is what he's ultimately aiming for. A science that's decanted, pun intended, from all sort of metaphysical sort of baggage, right? And that's what, for example, Hegel will do. Hegel will, in fact, and this is even more delirious if you think about it, claim to rise to the ideal of a presuppositionless science, right? And yet another strategy is to say that what Kant identified as invariant forms of our representational cognition are in fact forms of the structuration of space and time in a way that needs to be responsive to not only Newtonian mechanics and the quote unquote scholastic formal ontology that Kant inherited and inflected into the categories of the understanding, but that has to be sort of reworked into something like a transcendental physics or a transcendental naturalism. That's of course what Schelling does, right? And later in the 20th century, people like Gilles Deleuze will do. And we'll see how that takes shape. So there's another thing that is going on here. And of course, we haven't read this, but it's very interesting, which is after all these tortuous sort of contortions that Kant has to go through in the two editions of the imagination, after distinguishing the three faculties or the three operations of the threefold power of synthesis, their empirical and transcendental use, their coordination, the priority of the transcendental imagination, and then the highest concept, the meta concept of the unity of apperception. After he's gone through all of these contortions to guarantee the commensurability and integrity of representation, as those of you who have read the three critiques know, crisis strikes once again in the third critique, when he realizes that the very idea of nature being, organized categorially in lawful manner nevertheless does not outlaw the possibility of an anarchic sublimity that overrides the possibility of all empirical cognition or theoretical cognition. There could be an infinity of laws, for example, of nature, that override the possibility of any cognition. Many philosophers in the analytic tradition have retranslated this worry that Kant formulated in sort of a crass manner as a problem of gerrymandering the kinds of rules or regularities that one can formulate. In other words, the categories of the understanding might tell us at best that appearances, i.e. representations, are organized in relationships of cause and effect, successively in succession. However, to jump from there to say which are the laws of nature that actually describe the regularities that we observe in nature requires something much more that Kant does not have at his disposal. So the actual jump from the categories to something like Newtonian mechanics, right, the axioms of Newtonian mechanics, is still unwarranted. There's a gap there, because you can theoretically describe an infinity of possible axiomatic systems or possible regularities that describe the laws, the events that you witness in succession in an arbitrarily indefinite manner. So because there is, in principle, this excess of lawfulness is not outlawed, he needs this in the third critique, this last campaign, which is, of course, the whole theory of the sublime, the purposiveness without purpose of nature itself.
Daniel, sorry for interrupting, but we have only 3 minutes left.
Oh crap! Okay.
To decide about the presenters of presentations and the
yes. No, I need what I mentioned at the beginning, and I had several codes that I wanted to share, which are really good here. But we can get to that. I mean, there wasn't much left. I have to talk to the organizers, because if we have 23 presentations, we won't get to talk about anything. It's as simple as that, right? It's just so I have to actually talk to the organizers and say, hey, how do we want to do this? And so by next week we will know exactly what we're going to do with that. But provisionally, there will be a paper involved at the end. You basically, 7 to 10 pages or 12 pages or 15 pages. I mean, just don't give me a 30-page paper, please. I have and it will be on any other topics that we have covered, and any of the materials or any of the views, that you found interesting, or you can take it in your own direction. I'm happy to do that as well. Or if you wanted to take an alternative route and do something experimental, i.e. not an essay in the strict old-fashioned form, but either a work of art or some experimental form of writing, I'm also happy to contemplate that and to get that done. So basically, very laissez-faire. You can do basically what you want as long as it's rooted in the contents of the seminar. Any questions? I mean, we have precious little time, but hopefully, let me stop sharing this. Sorry.
I have a lot of questions, but I don't think we have time, no?
No, I don't think so. I mean, anything logistic that anybody wants to ask? Logistical? Oh, please, also, I'm loading, like right now, as soon as I close this window, the updated syllabus, so you can check it out, because the readings for next week are specified there. So next week, will you post the slides on the drive? Yes, as well. So I will be posting today's class also right now, so you can take a look over this. We'll take off next week where we started. Okay, so we'll keep talking about this a little bit more and look at a few more passages within the transcendental deduction, and then we'll cross over to the second part, which of course is our transcendental phenomenological investigation. I will say a few more things about the collapse of the transcendental project in its quote-unquote inception in the Kantian form, and say a few more things about the transcendental deduction itself, just to get started. But we will start next week with conversing about this body of work. Any questions? No? Well, then I think that's it for today. Evrim, you take it from here. I don't know what to do.
Yeah. So I will now stop the recording.
Okay, great.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody.